Chapter 1 Needlepoint Quotation Edward St. Aubin Bad News Heroin was the only thing that really worked, the only thing that stopped him scampering around in a hamster's wheel of unanswerable questions. Heroin was the cavalry. It landed purring at the base of his skull, wrapped itself darkly around his nervous system, like a black cat curling up on its favorite cushion. Chapter 1 Needlepoint By July of 1988, my life had narrowed to the point of a needle. I was living with my boyfriend Matt and selling cocaine. My only daily goals were first, to slog to a methadone program, and then somehow to ensure we made sufficient money to get high and pay for rent and cat supplies. That summer was simultaneously the best and the worst time of my life. It was the best because in August I would successfully kick cocaine and heroin addiction that had left me weighing 85 pounds with angry tracks dotting all four limbs, my hair a thin, over-bleached Madonna trying to be Marilyn Blonde, and my eyes distant and blank. It was also the worst because, well, I couldn't exactly recommend active addiction and early recovery. I was 23. I was out on bail facing mandatory minimum 15 to life sentence on a 1986 cocaine charge. Under New York State's Rockefeller drug laws, been busted with 2.5 kilos of cocaine, which made me look like a high level dealer. But the truth was that most of it belonged to Matt's suppliers, who had asked him to stash it. Few would have predicted such a future for a child who read at 3, who tried to channel her social awkwardness and became most likely to succeed in 8th grade, who excelled academically enough to be admitted to Columbia in its first class of women in 1983. But Columbia was now in my past. I couldn't study while facing the stress of a felony case. In fact, I couldn't do much at all, not even tasks of basic life care like household cleaning, bathing, and laundry. About here's where I'm supposed to tell you that I'm different, that I wasn't your typical addict. The American media repeatedly assures us that such an addict certainly isn't white, female, educated, or middle class, but I'm not going to do that. History demonstrates that the idea of a typical addict is itself a cruel stereotype, forged in a period of intense racism, while which has a great deal to do why our drug treatment system and drug policies are both draconian and ineffective. The whole notion is one of the hidden obstacles that keeps us from truly understanding drug issues. To do better, we need to understand what addiction really is and how our misguided attempts to define it have actually caused great harm. In 1980s, when I was addicted, great emphasis was placed on the distinction between physical and psychological addiction. And folk belief in the importance of this difference remains surprisingly common. Physical addiction was seen as medical, it was primarily a problem of dependence, of biologically coming to need a drug to function without being physically ill. Indeed, the official term for the problem in psychiatry's diagnostic manual in the 80s until 2013 was substance dependence. Psychological addiction, however, was seen as moral. It meant you had lost control over your mind and were weak willed, selfish, and bad. Physical addiction was real, psychological addiction was all in your head. Unfortunately, as people like me learned the hard way, the physical need for a drug to avoid withdrawal symptoms is not the core of the problem. Instead, psychology and the learning that influences it matters much more. In the summer of 1988, that psychology dominated my life. One of Matt's favorite words was fetid, and that aptly described our living conditions that summer. Our 750-month rental in Astoria, not far from the Triborough Bridge, was essentially a square divided into four rooms sparsely furnished, with a bare stained futon mattress on the floor in one bedroom, many books, comic books, records, CDs, a high end stereo system, and a few tables and chairs. Scattered around were the detritus of drug habits, bent blackened spoons, bulbous glass crack pipes, some of which were broken and had charred metal screens in their bowls. A few neon orange syringes, tops could be seen atop piles of dirty laundry, mine almost entirely black. In the corner of one bedroom was a desk with an early PC and a dot matrix printer, which I used to file articles I wrote for the stoner magazine High Times. My first national column, written under the pseudonym Morales, was called Piss Patrol and covered urine testing. A litter box stood in another corner, and our long haired grey tiger cat Smeek padded around, showing off his massive puffy tail. Smeek, at least, was well loved and perhaps a bit too well fed, but otherwise we lived in filth and disarray. And the litter certainly wasn't always clean. A situation Smeek sometimes protest by thinking outside the box, often on the scattered papers and clothes. Meanwhile, Matt had become grotesquely obsessed with his bodily functions and terrified of being arrested by firefighters. He thought that the men in red trucks were somehow able to monitor and detect fumes from the cocaine he smoked. He always kept the shades down, cautiously peeking out occasionally to see if the firefighters were on him. This once witty and artistic Jewish boy from Long Island now sat indoors most days wearing only tighty whities and surrounded by garbage, conceived, convinced that freebasing was destroying his digestive tract, but unable to stop himself. Every morning I'd tell myself that I wasn't going to shoot coke, knowing that it would only make me anxious, obsessive, and paranoid. Though at least not about firemen. I'd drag myself to the fortress like methadone program near the elevated subway lines at the base of the 59th Street Bridge. I had chosen to get this treatment. I knew being physically dependent on heroin was a problem, and I wanted help detoxing from it. I thought, in fact, that doing this would be all that needed to get me back on track. I was thoroughly steeped in America's paradoxical view of addiction. I thought it was simultaneously a moral and a medical problem. I couldn't accept that I had the moral problem. I thought that would mean that my intelligence, the only aspect of myself that I valued, was weak and corrupted. So I told myself I was just physically addicted and that methadone would somehow fix that. The idea was to wean me off from an illegal opiate by providing a safe, clean, non injectable legal one in progressively lower amounts over the course of 6 months. The Bridge Plaza Methadone Maintenance Program started by first stabilizing me on what I now know is far too low a dose. An effective dose of methadone varies from patient to patient but is typically over 60 milligrams. I was given 30, and ultimately reduces cravings for heroin without producing euphoria. At such a dose, methadone also blocks your high if you relapse. I never experienced that. But even if the program had gotten the original dose right, it wouldn't have mattered much. They began tapering me almost immediately, decreasing methadone in what research had already shown by the time to be highly ineffective way of using the drug. Consequently, as the data could have predicted, I titrated up my heroin use as they ran the methadone down, rendering the entire exercise useless while sustaining my physical dependence. I felt hopelessly. I felt hopeless, trapped. So I changed tactics. First, I convinced myself that methadone actually made the detox process worse. The word on the street was that kicking heroin was easier than methadone detox because the worst of heroin withdrawal lasts around 2 harsh weeks, while methadone withdrawal is more protracted, lasting months. Though, if done right, I later learned it should be less severe. My new plan was to quit drugs, became this one. I would complete the methadone detox afterwards, just do heroin for a few weeks to get the methadone out of my system. Then I'd stop for good. And yeah, I'd stop the cocaine at that point too. Today, however, I just have one more shot. Since Matt and I were selling cocaine and virtually always had it around, that one injection would soon lead to dozens. I'd dig for one of my few remaining accessible veins, awaiting the moment when I'd strike it rich, watching the blood blossom up into the barrel like a gusher of oil. But even when that happened easily, the euphoria no longer sparkled. It was contaminated with paranoia, shadowed by a looming overhang of objectless dread. What had started as a burst of excitement that opened me a sense of endless opportunity and capacity was now fraught with fear and a feeling of being stuck, not liberated. Desire curled into dread that only prompted more fruitless and frustrating desire for more. Wired to the gills, shaking, unable to relax, my heart seeming to pound louder than it should. I'd then realize that the only thing that would help was heroin, that would produce an epic quest to cop in what were then dire neighborhoods in Bushwick, Brooklyn, or Manhattan's Lower East Side. I was terrified of getting arrested while buying, not only for the usual reasons, but because I was afraid of what effect it would have on the conditions of my bail. Therefore, on both of my divorced parents' houses, which served together as collateral instead of 50,000 in cash, the high bail was set because the 2,000 kilos of cocaine I'd charged with possessing when I got busted legally qualified me as a high level dealer, although that was hardly the reality. It was actually my first arrest. Consequently, to minimize rearrest risk, I wouldn't buy for myself, but I would instead ride along with friends who would score on the street for me in return for a share of the drugs. We'd drive in someone's clunker of a car to Bushwick on the Brooklyn Queens Expressway, shivering past the acres of graveyards that divides the two boroughs. When we got close, I'd slump out of sight in the passenger seat or the back seat. My race and ragged looks made it obvious why we were in the neighborhood. I'd wait anxiously as whoever had agreed to drive darted into decrepit, graffitied buildings, always taking what seemed like years to return. The heroin, if we managed to procure decent stuff, not ineffective, adulterated dross, would win me a few blessed hours of blissful calm. When I got home, I'd heat the spoon to prepare the heroin, which I dissolve in water, adding a dash of coke when it cooled, then injecting the mixture. If the drugs were good and my tolerance wasn't too high, a rare concurrence at this stage of my addiction. The first hit would be heavenly, like a flourish from a brass section. The cocaine would trumpet a burst of exhilaration as I pressed the plunger in. I could taste the icy flavor at the back of my throat, A few moments later, the warmer, soothing harmony of the heroine would take over. Every atom in my body felt calm, safe, fed, content, and most of all, loved. Unfortunately, however, before long, I'd decide that another shot of cocaine would be nice. That would start a compulsive cycle of just one more, until the cocaine's anxious alertness blotted out the heroine's sedative effect entirely. After a sleepless night, the next day would be exactly the same, starting with the humiliations of the methadone program, low slung, low slung located in a forbidding light industrial area in the shadows of the elevated tracks for the N and 7 trains, surrounded by businesses like auto parts suppliers. The place looked like a prison. Every feature bespoke an emphasis on security and the siege mentality that comes with trying to retain valuables when you see all of your customers as criminals. Rain, snow, sleet, or hail. There was no weather extreme enough to keep a line from forming outside before the clinic's early morning opening time. So we could be medicated to stave off withdrawal. At that minute, sometimes a bit later, but never a second before, the heavy metal store would crack open and we'd be herded into a man's trap and monitored by video camera. After the first door closed, a second equally armored and imposing portal would open to admit us. Next, we'd line up inside. Often, you would have to provide a urine sample before you'd get your bitter cocktail of methadone, orangeade from a nurse using a precisely calibrated, heavily deafened machine. This process posed a problem for me that summer. I was virtually always dehydrated from shooting drugs the night before, and if I had to give an observed urine, the woman charged with that lovely job would have to stand there waiting until I was able to eke out enough pee. They could have just asked if I had taken drugs. I don't think I ever gave the place clean urine, and my using should have been a signal that I needed additional assistance. But that approach would have required them to see me as a fellow human who was ill, not just another junkie. And it would have required genuinely individualized therapy, not just bureaucratic rules. This was my first personal encounter with supposedly professional help for addiction, a system that calls you dirty if you relapse, one that assumes you're a liar, a thief, or worse, and responds to increasing symptoms of addiction not by offering more help but by punishment or expulsion. Indeed, as it became clear that my detox was failing, I asked my counselor if I could stay on methadone longer to see if I could stabilize and improve. But I was told that I hadn't used heroin for long enough to be given long term methadone treatment, and besides, I took too much cocaine. In other words, in other words, while it was clear that I wouldn't successfully detox, my problem was both too bad, the coke, and not bad enough, too few years on heroin, for me to get more help. The fact that I exhibited symptoms of addiction was basically why I was expelled from the treatment for it. I wasn't even offered a referral for any type of additional rehab or medical care, despite the fact that it was the peak of the HIV epidemic in intravenous drug users in the United States. And I was in New York City, the epicenter of that epidemic. At least half of the injection drug users in the city were already infected. Among there were many of my friends with whom I could have shared needles. In any other area of medicine during a global pandemic, such care would be considered malpractice. Still, that's what I received, and what sadly is still all too common today, with at least one third of all methadone programs failing to provide an adequate dose. But as unbelievable as it seems even to me, despite shooting up dozens of times a day, facing felony drug charges despite being on a methadone program for heroin addicts, and having dropped out of college following my arrest, I didn't yet see myself as a real drug addict. That would change on August 4th. That was the day I recognized that I was about to cross a line to meet my own carefully designed criteria for addiction, specifically created mainly to try to exclude myself, I must admit. While recovery stories are often told as though they result from sudden insight that prompts life altering action, in reality, studies find that psychological breakthroughs are not the typical path to change and rarely lead directly or in any linear way to alterations in behavior. Indeed, research suggests that having an intention to do something only predicts engaging in the desired behavior about 33% of the time. Even for people without drug problems, learning a new behavior typically takes time. My experience was somewhat different. My story may be an example of a recovery path that researcher William Miller has labeled quantum change, in which a minority of people do suddenly completely shift course as opposed to the more typical gradual process of fits and starts. It could also be the case that my brain's natural maturation process finally reached the point where my executive function could begin to pull the brakes on the regions that create desire. This change allowed my epiphany to save my life. Either way, it had been one of those days dominated by the flat sense of terror that occupied my consciousness, whether I wasn't sufficiently drugged. I was no longer on methadone, which meant that I was back to heroin and coke. I felt incessant premonitory angst of withdrawal. To elude it, that afternoon I went to the Lower East Side with Heather, the girlfriend of one of Matt's friends. It was hot on the streets, literally and figuratively. No one seemed to be selling. Finally, however, she spotted a tout, a person who introduces buyers to sellers, and went off to make the transaction while I stood and waited. I thought my heart would jump out of my chest every time I heard a loud noise or saw a car that might be the police. It was a few years after Operation Pressure Point, the first of several major police crackdowns that constantly swept users and low level dealers into the justice system. I was on a street that led a series of low squat housing projects which somehow seemed menacing in their red brick uniformity. I wanted to hide. Passerby seemed to look right past me as though I was an unfortunate pass part of the street furniture, like an overflowing garbage can. I hung my head and looked away. A dream I'd had the previous week popped into my mind. In it, I'd been struggling to fend off some type of space alien parasite that wanted to embed itself into my brain. I watched it merge with others, giving them unspeakable bliss, destroying their individuality and controlling their every move. Once it got you, you were part of it and couldn't be yourself anymore. I tried to flee, but nowhere was safe. And as a friend betrayed my hiding place to it, I started to be engulfed. I woke up, panicked, shaken. In retrospect, it seemed like something in me was preparing for change. I started to worry that Heather had gotten arrested and that I would be stuck on this corner in the hot sun for hours, getting sicker and sicker. But suddenly she appeared from around a corner, walking with quick, purposeful pace that I knew meant that she had scored. When we got back to Queens, though everything went wrong, there were several different brands in the two bundles, 10 bags per $100 bundle. One for her and her partner, one for me. She she had purchased. Street heroin suppliers stamp their produce with often ghoulishly humorous brand names. Evergreens like DOA, 7 to Life, and Poison alternating with ripped from headlines snarks like today's Obamacare. The variety of brands, however, wasn't a good sign. If it's not a rip-off, you generally get one or at most two stamps from any particular street seller. I dumped the contents of one bag into a spoon as I got into the kitchen. I was definitely starting to feel ill now. Withdrawal was actually much worse when you got the drug in your possession and know you can have it soon, but not yet. It didn't smell right as it hit the water. Still, I shot it anyway to no effect. And that was when my mind, no thanks, I suspect, to the pharmacology of the apparently inert substance in the packet, really did change. I found myself begging to Heather's boyfriend, a man I didn't especially like, for some of the differently branded bags she had given him. Her street name was Beaver, brown haired and braided with a distinct overbite. B rather resembled one of these dam building creatures, though not because of their reputed industriousness, but usually extremely laid back. I often I found myself pleading with him for another brand of heroin in the hopes that at least one of the bags might contain real dope. I couldn't afford to buy more. I was desperate, with withdrawal clearly starting to close in. And I argued, since he wasn't physically dependent at the time, the only consequence for him would be that he just wasn't able to get high that day. I, on the other hand, would be sick. Besides, I knew I had to appear in court the next day, one in an endless string of continuances that my lawyer sought to delay the day of reckoning on my terrifying Rockefeller case. I'd already completed the methadone program. I was supposed to be well, but Beaver wouldn't budge. And in my panic, the thought crossed my mind that I might try to seduce him just to get the drugs. It didn't matter that both my boyfriend and girlfriend were in the same room with us. It didn't matter that I had a really snobbish attitude towards him and was not attracted to him. It didn't matter that the idea was basically completely insane and unlikely to succeed. My brain was searching for any strategy, any way of obtaining heroin, however absurd. When the thought occurred to me, however, it shocked me. I didn't mean to judge those who exchange sex for drugs or engage in prostitution to support their habits. If harm occurs, they themselves are most likely victims, and many women who do this have lengthy histories of childhood sexual abuse. However, I personally couldn't fathom the idea. For one, I'm seriously sensitive to touch, shame, and rejection. Second, I had this bizarre misconception that you had to be exceptionally beautiful in order to get men to pay for it. And well, my self esteem was comically not high enough to believe I'd pass as a credible prostitute. Consequently, the idea of seducing Beaver was so beyond what I'd ever normally consider that it immediately forced me to contemplate what had previously been unthinkable. Consequently, the idea of seducing Beaver was so beyond what I'd ever normally considered that it immediately forced me to contemplate what had previously been unthinkable. That I was a debased addict physically, psychologically, whatever you wanted to call it. The line I was about to cross was for me a sign that I clearly in what formerly seen as alien territory where those weak-willed addicts dwelled. Now something in me began to shift. I considered my early drug use, marijuana and hash in high school, LSD at Grateful Dead shows, cocaine in chic nightclubs. I pictured myself in my dorm in Colombia, weighing out, weighing quartergrams of what then saw as a harmless drug that brought joy and aided study. I remembered the parties, especially at one of New York's most exclusive addresses, a Fifth Avenue apartment high above 86th Street, overlooking Central Park, somewhere I'd never been invited if I hadn't been selling drugs. Then I flashed on late nights, unable to stop, unable to sleep, with a bleeding nose, and all that glamour drained away. I thought about being suspended from school for dealing, and later, after being readmitted my arrest, I saw myself snorting heroin, then shooting it, and now here in this filthy apartment, begging a man I didn't like for drugs. I looked around, and it was as if I was seeing my home and myself in it for the first time. The car The cat litter hadn't been changed for too long, and it gave off an evil stench. Everything was covered in a layer of grime, cat hair clotted with dust atop soiled laundry, burnt, shattered crack pipes on yellowing newspapers. The atmosphere was nauseating. I was suddenly amazed at my surroundings and unable to comprehend how I had lived in such a state for years. It was as if a camera had pulled back and instantly, rather than seeing an incomprehensible mass of lines and colors, I could see my life for what it was. As I begged for heroin, the lens through which I saw the world shattered, and suddenly everything I thought was uncertain, everything I thought I knew about drugs in my life was no longer sure. That was when I decided that I needed help. My father would be meeting me in the courtroom the next day. He always showed up no matter how wretched and hopeless I seemed. My mother, in contrast, had found attending my court appearances so upsetting that she stayed away. For at least 6 months, she'd begin limiting even our phone conversations to brief talks in which she'd always suggest rehab. This tactic had been recommended to her by her therapist, and in drug counseling classes she'd been taking to train for a second career. I resolved to ask my dad to take me upstate to her house so my mom could get me into treatment. I remember my final night of using that bad shot turned out to be my last one, as a blur of unpleasant sensations that heralded my ongoing descent into withdrawal. I went to court sick, sweaty. I wore a black but at least brightly flowered business dress, my bones jutting out. I was so weak I could barely open the wooden half door to the defendant's well. My lawyer, Donald Vogelman, a prominent defense attorney, gallantly did it for me. He was tall and solidly built, in his late 30s or 40s, with dark hair and a strong Brooklyn accent. Judge Leslie Croker Snyder, a former prosecutor famed as the Dragon Lady for her harsh sentencing policies, later said that she had been considering locking me up for my own good. If I hadn't sought help that day, she had straight, perfectly coiffed black hair. Her voice and body language visibly projected power and authority, not just her robes. She was also well known she was so well known for her harsh sentencing that she needed round the clock police protection from hitmen sent by drug lords angered by sentences stretching up to 120 years. As I stood before her in court, I was so painfully thin and pale that I could have been mistaken for a cancer patient, and was in fact soon suspected of having anorexia. I hadn't been trying to lose weight, it was just that cocaine took away my appetite. When I did bother to eat, my diet consisted of almost exclusively Boston cream pie and other sweets from Astoria's excellent, plentiful bakeries. My hair also testified to my poor health. Once an over the top Jufro, Jufro, it was now brittle and thin and hung in clumps as if I'd had chemotherapy. Not only had I damaged it with too much bleach, I'd developed I'd developed trichotillomania, a habit of compulsively pulling strands out which can be associated with cocaine addiction. Adding all together, I looked more than twice my age with my pupils dilated by withdrawal. I looked haunted. My mother described me at this stage of my addiction as looking as though there was no one home behind my eyes. I started inpatient detox in August 4th, 1988. Is the day I now see as the beginning of my recovery. What changed my mind wasn't just the weight of all the legal pressure or my worsening health. It was my sudden realization that I had met my own personal criteria of addiction. I hadn't stopped at the worst moment in my using or when I had hit bottom. That would have been either the day I got suspended from Colombia or the night I got arrested, taken out of my apartment in handcuffs, or when my father bailed me out after that arrest. Instead, I stopped when I diagnosed myself or basically learned that I was an addict. End chapter 1.